Okay, I think it's time we get started. So kia ora everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar on the EU's response to the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Alexander Prenter. I'm Senior Public Affairs Consultant at Lighthouse Europe, and I'll be hosting this webinar. I'm also joined today by my colleagues Mathilde Adjutor and Rosario Perize. Just please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to the public afterwards. We'll also be live tweeting this event with the following hashtag, which you can see on your screen. It's hashtag EU response for New Zealand. Before we start, I just want to take a short message about Lighthouse Europe and who we are. So we're a public affairs consultancy based in Brussels and Paris. We specialize in all areas of the European Union policy-making process, and we represent a wide range of clients in the digital services and agricultural sectors. For more information, please check out our website, www.lighthouseeurope.com, and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. So here's our agenda for the day. This webinar will explain the economic response primarily of the EU's COVID-19 response. We'll start today with a few words from the Vice Chair of the European Parliament delegation to Australia and New Zealand, Mr. Axel Voss. Then we'll move into a state of play and the policy response from the European Union. And then we'll briefly touch upon what some member states are doing, particularly Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And for the Italian section, my colleague Rosario is going to take over to explain that. We'll then round off the discussion with some points on the implications that all of this might have for New Zealand businesses looking ahead. And I hope that we have a lively discussion in the Q&A section where you can ask any questions you want about COVID-19 in the EU and anything about the EU response to COVID-19 and actually just about the European Union in general, if you like. If you have questions about particular member states of the EU, we also invite those questions as well. And we can, or if we don't have the answer for you on the ready, we can get back to you at a later stage. So now we're going to just turn to the address from Mr. Axel Voss. He recorded this in advance and sent it to us.
Kia ora to you all. Thanks to Lighthouse Europe that they are organizing a webinar on the EU response to COVID-19. This is a wonderful idea and a good idea also for both sides of the world, but I'm very sorry that I couldn't attend now this meeting because of other reasons. So I'm sad about this, but I hope Lighthouse Europe will also inform me what the outcome of this webinar and the content of the discussions are. So it's very important that we are exchanging our views not only on the crisis but also on other things and issues, but what we have in mind is also that we can rely on each other. So we won't retreat only within the EU regarding this COVID-19 crisis. We also relying on our partners and friends like New Zealand, that we might coming together through this crisis. And of course, what we have in mind is not only to fight this crisis together and then having also in mind that we are coming forward with the negotiable free trade agreement, what we so far have. There are some problems in the agriculture sector, but we will overcome these and I hope as soon as possible. Of course, the crisis means probably also a kind of a postponement of the negotiations, but this doesn't mean that we will give up this free trade agreement. It's the opposite. We are very much interested in having you on board and having you on our side, and that we can also have a fair trade also in each direction. And that's why I hope this will be closed in a very short time, that we are coming forward and that we can show the world that we are standing together and going in the same direction. And also we are looking forward, and a lot of Germans and a lot of Europeans are loving your country. And I know already a lot of people would like to visit you and to see your wonderful landscape in New Zealand, this wonderful climate what you have. And I hope also that some New Zealanders will also enjoy the European way of living, or Europe with its diverse cultural heritage. So that's why I would say you are always invited to come here, but we know, of course, we have to go through this crisis. And this is one important thing. I do not know if we at the end may not trust travelers from coming from specific places of the world where might be a kind of a hotspot of this crisis. But at the end, I hope we will get a vaccination of all of us, that we can travel freely and free of this virus again. So I'm sorry once again that I can't attend. I'm sorry that I can't probably answer the questions you might have, but I'm asking Lighthouse Europe also, if you have some specific questions, please let us know. We are very much appreciate also that we can answer this question, and that we might still in contact and keep in contact through this. In the European Parliament you have wonderful representatives, not only in your ambassador and the whole team around the ambassador. You also have the delegation from the European Parliament, and we are the one who would like to take care of also everything what you might interested on. So once again, let's stand together, let's fight together also the virus, and let's trade together, and let's be partners, and let's be friends, and have a successful webinar. Bye-bye.
So with those words, I just wanted to start with a state of play of where we're at with the COVID-19 crisis and the health situation. So COVID was first identified in December in 2019. I'm sure you're all well aware of that. As of today, there were over 4 million cases globally and 270,000 deaths. The EU has been one of the hardest hit regions, particularly in countries like Italy, Spain as well, which have both seen very high numbers of deaths as well. And Europe accounts for almost a third of the global total. Like New Zealand, the response has been to lock down economies. However, I should note already that this has not been the case across the board, and some member states have had tougher restrictions than others. With that said, the 5 major EU economies have all got extensive lockdown measures in place that are now slowly beginning to be lifted. It really depends on the circumstances of the particular member state in question. So as my colleague will stress later, even within member states, there is a differentiated approach to the COVID-19 crisis, and some regions within member states will open up sooner than others. In terms of the economic fallout, the perspective is not looking very good. The lockdown has been devastating to the economy. According to the European Union Office of Statistics, the GDP has contracted 3.5% in the first quarter of this year, which is the sharpest decline since 1995. And the latest economic forecasts from Tuesday last week show GDP shrinking in the EU area 7.4% this year. And this contraction will occur across the board, but unevenly. So in France, for example, the French finance minister Bruno Le Maire is expecting an 8% decrease in France, whereas in Germany, Peter Altmaier, the German finance minister, he's forecasting 6.3% decrease in Germany. The flip side of this, as we'll discuss later, is that the rebound will not be uniform across the EU, and we will face potentially further divergences across the Union and that this will accentuate distortions in the marketplace. So as well, in terms of unemployment, the most recent data shows that unemployment will reach approximately 9% across the EU, and this is an increase from 6.7% last year. On this slide in particular, I've lifted some graphs from last week's economic forecast to demonstrate the GDP decrease for this year, and also a comparison to the previous economic crisis in 2008 to 2012. I encourage everybody, if you're interested in these sorts of statistics, is to check out the economic forecast. I've included the link in this slide. So then what is the European Union actually doing to tackle the crisis? At this point, it's really important to emphasize that unlike in New Zealand or in the United States, the European Union is an incomplete project in the sense that the EU, the European Union, shares or has exclusive competence over different areas of the economy, of society, we could say. And so the measures taken which affect COVID-19 happen on different levels. So you can't just talk about an EU level, you have to also look at the member states. So today we're going to talk about the EU focus in particular, but if you want to have a complete picture, you also need to look at what the member states are doing as well. So an area, for example, where the EU has exclusive competence is in areas like competition policy and customs controls and tariffs, these sorts of things, whereas the member states have complete competency over healthcare and education and border control. So the EU has a coordinating role in these areas, but they cannot control what member states do. So then what has the EU specifically done? On this slide, I've included not everything that they've been doing, but certainly the most important things that might affect New Zealand businesses looking at the EU. So on the three main goals of the COVID-19 response package are to ensure that there's sufficient liquidity in the markets, save as many businesses from collapse, and to preserve as many jobs as possible. Unlike in 2008, the EU has been very swift to respond to this crisis, and since then a number of tools have been put in place that allow the EU to respond decisively. So this first package was released on April 9th, or announced, I should say, on April 9th, and it's the first stage of a larger plan for economic recovery. The biggest section of this is a 540 billion euro rescue package divided into three sections, which I'll go through in the following slides. And then there's also some measures taken by the ECB and a few other measures taken by the European Union in regards to competition policy and budgets. So let's delve into some of the details. So starting with the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM is support for those member states who use the euro as their currency, and with the aim of providing liquidity for states for direct and indirect response to COVID-19. This package will become operational on June 1st, and as part of this package, member states have committed to provide liquidity for sectors facing disruptions and companies facing liquidity shortages. These consist of public guarantee schemes and deferred tax payments, which now are estimated at 16% of EU GDP. Next, we have the SURE program, which is a new temporary support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency. This is an interim compromise that followed a debate on so-called corona bonds. It will allow for financial assistance of up to 100 billion euros in the form of loans from the EU to affected member states. The SURE program is available to all member states of the European Union, unlike the ESM, which is only available to Eurozone member states. This program supports efforts to shore up labour markets and provide temporary workers insurance. This program is intended for businesses, but is steered through member states' administrations. Then the third piece of this package is the European Investment Bank. In this regard, they have launched a 25 billion euro fund, which will support 200 billion euros of financing for companies with a focus on SMEs throughout the EU. Access to this financing is through national promotional banks in the member states. So whereas the two previous programs are directed more towards member states, the EIB gives access to funds through normal commercial banks. In addition to the European Investment Bank, we have the European Central Bank. And they have started a 750 billion pandemic emergency purchase program to purchase different assets of member states. This expands the eligible assets under corporate sector purchasing programs and eases collateral standards. This is on top of an already planned 120 billion euro purchasing program decided last year. Purchasing of assets will continue until the end of the crisis, and at the very least until the end of 2020. According to the spring forecast, released last week, as I mentioned already, these liquidity measures amount to about 22% of EU GDP. Now, there's an important caveat to this, is that I think it was last week, the German Constitutional Court gave a unfavorable ruling towards quantitative easing that the ECB has been doing for the past 5 years. The ruling applies since quantitative easing since 2015 and not the present crisis. However, if the ECB does not comply with the Constitutional Court's ruling within 3 months, this could have a significant impact in the future, because it means the European Central Bank will not be able to purchase German government bonds. So for countries like Italy, who are very much reliant upon ECB purchasing programs, this could send them into a tailspin, and that will create a domino effect in the European Union. It's very unclear how this is going to shake out in the future, so I'm not going to comment further on it, but I would just definitely want to put it on your radar. So some of the additional measures which the EU are taking is the loosening of budgetary restraints. So fiscal rules are set by the Stability and Growth Pact. This was set up at the end of the previous crisis to ensure that countries in the European Union pursue sound public finances. Back in March, the Ministers of Finance agreed that the conditions for a general escape clause in the fiscal framework were met. And this offers flexibility to national budgets to support the economy and to respond in a coordinated manner to the impact of COVID-19. Overall fiscal guidance is provided by the European Union in a streamlined European semester exercise. However, with the general escape clause, member states are free to run up their deficits past the maximum threshold of 4% of GDP. This will result in an aggregate government deficit in the Eurozone to surge from 0.6% last year to over 8.5% this year. A second thing they can do, which is an exclusive competence of the European Union, is to relax competition rules. So state aid rules, as I mentioned, which are the exclusive competence of the European Union, which are a part of competition policy, have been loosened to expedite public support to companies. So far, the Commission has cleared the way for over 1.9 trillion euros of funding through state aid, and over half of this has been granted to Germany. A concern, however, is that this policy could distort competition because some member states have greater capacity within their government finances to support their industries. More specific information on state aid and competition law, you can look at that on the website of DG Comp to find out which specific grants are being given. And if you have any particular questions about EU competition law, we have expertise at Lighthouse Europe who can answer any of your questions about that. And then finally, we have the EU budget. So this is the multi-annual financial framework, which is a 7-year budgetary cycle. So we actually just completed the negotiations for the MFF before the crisis happened. And so because of the crisis, they've had to renegotiate those. These discussions are still ongoing. But it looks as though the European Commission wants to increase the budget to 2% of EU GDP and set aside a 1.5 trillion euro recovery fund. And this could be ready by September. The financing of this 1.5 trillion euro recovery fund is very much up for debate still. There are concerns about this corona bonds and the mutualization of debt. So there's still some political hurdles to get through. However, the Commission has already come out and said that they will be considering purchasing financing the fund through the financial markets and then offering preferential rates to member states. This recovery fund will be specifically targeted to those member states who don't have the means to support their industries. We're talking about countries like Spain and Italy and some of those other southern countries. Now, as I should also mention, within the MFF is the Common Agricultural Policy. It's not looking as if this will be increased, but it's impossible for it to be decreased because a number of groups have already come out saying they will not decrease funding for the CAP. And the Common Agriculture Policy, I should mention, is what subsidizes farmers in the European Union. So that ends the major economic response to the EU. And I'm going to pass now to an area which might be of some interest to some of you, and that is the travel restrictions. So, particularly for those of you who travel for work, this is perhaps of special importance. In this area, the legal competencies are shared between the member states in the EU, and therefore the response, although coordinated, will be still a patchwork, and it is primarily within the control of individual member states to open their borders. Furthermore, I should add is that tomorrow, well, today your time, tomorrow our time, the Commission will adopt a new package on tourism, transport and borders, which you should consult if you have any particular interest in this area. Back on March 16, the Commission invited member states to introduce temporary restrictions on non-essential travel to the EU for an initial period of 30 days. This was renewed again until at least the 15th of May. And indeed, actually, the latest news is that the internal borders will not open until 15th of June. All EU member states, except for Ireland, and the non-EU Schengen countries have taken measures to implement travel restrictions. Goods are still able to flow between member states. The Commission started an initiative called the Green Lanes Initiative, and this has been a big success. So goods are still flowing between member states. However, the caveat here is that personal protective equipment, so materials related to COVID-19, these are still subject to export authorization. But aside from this one area, goods are flowing very well within the EU. With that said, there are still pressures being felt in a number of sectors that are reliant upon seasonal workers, and this should include non-EU citizen seasonal workers as well. So the Commission has asked that these workers be included within the category of essential, but it's really unclear at this stage whether this will be effective, because as I mentioned before, it's member states who control the borders. And so some member states will open up and some of them likely will not. So external borders will only be lifted, external borders to the EU will only be lifted on a country by country basis. But member states are supposed to coordinate closely with one another before they do so. So this ends the section on the EU measures to COVID-19. We're now going to pass to the member states section, where I'm going to talk about Germany and the United Kingdom, and my colleague Rosario will discuss Italy. So Germany has cut its economic forecast by 6.3% this year and expects the recession to bottom out in the second quarter for a rebound by the end of the year to be felt in 2021, with an expected expansion of 5.2%. In response to the crisis, Germany has approved an initial package of 750 billion euros to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus outbreak. The government is taking on new debt for the first time since 2013. The first package, agreed in March, comprises a supplementary budget of 156 billion euros and a stabilization fund of 600 billion. And these will be loans to struggling businesses. 100 billion euros of this 600 billion will be used to take direct equity stakes in companies so that they're not subject to foreign takeovers. Some information that might be useful for the audience is that the Federal Ministry of Economy and Energy has set up a supply chain contact point for companies. It handles all issues related either to the production and delivery of component products or to the supply of raw materials in general. Companies experiencing any problems with international supply chains should contact the email address I have in the slides. And I've included at the bottom of this slide a caveat is that Germany will hold the presidency of the Council of Europe from June. And so in some respects, this is good news because they're the biggest member state in the EU, and they can provide some leadership at this desperately needed time. If you have any questions about what the presidency of the Council of Europe entails, we can ask those questions in the Q&A session. So I'm now going to pass to my colleague Rosario, who's going to explain to you what's going on in Italy.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everybody. So as you might already be aware of, Italy is the first and probably most hit country by the COVID-19 crisis in the EU. If we also consider the size of its economy, its high debt rate, we come to the easy conclusion that looking at Italy is not enough, but this is a sensitive country in the EU and beyond. As you can see in the slide, there are some forecasts that talk about a GDP cut of 9.5%. The government is talking about an 8%. Goldman Sachs is talking about a minus 11%. But besides this, considering that the crisis is unprecedented and even the response isn't unprecedented, as Alex was already mentioning, it is important at this stage to talk about trends, about what happened in the lockdown phase, what is happening now in the economic relaunch phase, and what we can expect as for economic responses and political in the next weeks. So in this short overview, I would really like to talk about these three phases. So what happened between the 8th of March and the 4th of May, what is happening now, and what we can expect in the next weeks. Before doing that, I have some preliminary considerations to do together with you. So first of all, if we want to look at the Italian crisis, we have to look far before the outbreak of the Italian crisis in the country, because Italy is growingly interdependent with some countries outside the EU, such as China, and its growing interdependence with China made the economic crisis anticipate the outbreak in Italy. Second consideration, the most impacted regions are also the most productive ones. Lombardia, Veneto, and Emilia-Romagna alone account for 40% of the country's GDP. And finally, generally speaking, luxury products and GI are being the most impacted products, at least in the short run. And these are the products that are commonly known in foreign markets as the made in Italy products. So let's start with phase one. It is the full confinement phase, very similar to what happened in France. Many sectors stopped producing in the country, but the agri-food supply chain did not stop its production. So as we might expect, consumption in the agri-food sector, generally speaking, has increased. Consumption patterns, though, have varied a lot, given panic buying attitudes of most consumers and the preference towards long-lasting products. So the first victim in this full lockdown phase where fresh products, we are talking here about milk and dairy products in particular, and the DOP products, so the protected ones. We're not talking here about fresh fruits and vegetables, even kiwi, which are a different case. We can discuss further about this in the Q&A section, but we are specifically talking about milk, dairy products, and wine. In this full lockdown phase, not many initiatives have been taken to relaunch the economy. So we don't really have a far-reaching plan. It was mostly supporting independent workers that could not really afford being closed. So supporting consumptions and not really a far-reaching plan. Things might change now, because as of the 4th of May, Italy started reopening production in a broad variety of sectors. And in the meantime, the Italian government put in place a number of measures accounting for 55 billion euros. We have many initiatives at the moment on the table of the government. Ministries sent lots of initiatives. The document is very, very big. It's a document of 766 pages, lots of initiatives, but not a full governmental decree has been at the moment published. So we still have a draft. Two initiatives, though, for this seminar are very important. First, an emergency fund to protect economic sectors in crisis, including the ones that we were discussing that were worst hit by the full lockdown phase, with a dedicated budget that will be spent in agricultural, fisheries, and aquaculture sectors. And then as for foreign markets and international trade fairs, there will be a tax credit of 40% of the fairs themselves. What can we expect now then? So in the next week, many things will happen, and Italy will respond politically according to how the virus is spread across the country. But as Alex was already anticipating, we need to look differently at this new phase. So three final conclusions, some food for thought can be said at this stage. The first is that differentiated measures might be taken on a region by region basis or according to different areas of the country. So it will be increasingly important to look at regions within the country itself, particularly for the GIs or protected products. A second consideration is that in this framework, considering also these differentiated measures, looking at the three most important regions, which are also the most impacted ones, is utterly important. And finally, that as we were saying already with China, trade routes will start picking up the pace, but there has been already a trade diversion towards other markets. This is very important because markets that can now allow to buy these products have a very, very big advantage compared to in full lockdown. Because in the following weeks, prices of a number of these products might slightly decrease due to many factors that we can discuss further if you want afterwards. But it is really important to see whether this will open up to new trade opportunities. So this is my, let's say, last food for thought for the next phases. I leave it back to you, Alex, and I thank you all.
Thanks, Rosario, for your words. Let's finally move into the final slide on the United Kingdom. So the UK's economic response has been actually more delayed than the other member states. As part of their response, the British government has set up a £42 billion coronavirus job retention scheme that pays up to 80% of a worker's salary. All UK employers are able to access the support, and it is available for at least 3 months with the possibility to be extended further. The government is also deferring VAT payments, so that's GST. All UK businesses are eligible. The deferral was applied from the 20th of March and will continue until the 30th of June. The deferral is automatic, so you don't need to do any applications. The government is also ensuring that loans are available to help businesses stay afloat through a new temporary coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. This is delivered via the British Business Bank. The government will provide lenders with a guarantee of 80% on each loan, and the government will not charge businesses or banks for this guarantee. The scheme will support loans of up to £25 million in value. On the 7th of May, the Bank of England also acted, and they voted to keep the official interest rate at 0.1%. And since January, the Bank of England has injected a further £200 billion into the UK economy through quantitative easing. Despite these actions, unemployment is likely to hit 10% in the UK from its current 3.9%, and it should ease back to about 7.3% at the end of the year. And I've included at the bottom of the slide a word about Brexit, because this is always the hot topic. We're talking about the UK. The UK officially left the EU at the end of 2019, and the two parties have now entered a withdrawal period until the 31st of December 2020. Negotiations on the future relationship are ongoing, and according to the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the EU law still applies in the UK. I'm not going to comment any further on Brexit because the negotiations, as I said, are still ongoing. I will put a caveat, though, that the current economic forecasts presume that the UK remains a member of the EU. So it doesn't even factor in the future relationship. This means that with a deal or without a deal, the economic projections are going to change for better or for worse. On my final slide, we're going to talk about some of the implications for New Zealand businesses looking towards Europe. I hope by now that it's somewhat clear what the different policies are that the EU are pursuing and taking in response to COVID-19. And I would say also that some of the implications might not be felt for some time for you guys in New Zealand. One of the greatest concerns is the uneven economic recovery across the member states and the distortions that national measures may have on future competition within the EU. An uneven recovery will dampen future growth and demand in the EU, so New Zealand businesses may find it more difficult to find markets in the EU. Since EU GDP is forecast to contract by 7.5% this year, far deeper than the global financial crisis in 2009, the rebound is only going to be 6% in 2021, and this rebound will leave the European economy at the end of the forecast horizon about 3% lower than the output level implied by the initial autumn 2019 economic forecast. So it won't be until 2022 that Europe will have recovered from this crisis. Moreover, certain member states will recover faster than others because they have more room for maneuver to provide public stimulus to industry. The incomplete recovery on one member state has the potential to spill over into others due to interdependencies in the markets. As I mentioned before, this will dampen future growth. The second implication for New Zealand businesses are the potential future access restrictions to the EU market due to a steep drop in prices for agricultural products such as beef, lamb, and dairy. To illustrate this point, I've been seeing reports that French cheesemakers are warning that the closure of food service channels will result in a 60% slump in international sales for cheeses like Camembert and Roquefort. The result is that farmers are switching production to better preserved products such as butter and milk powder, leading to a sharp fall in prices for skim and whole milk powder. The European Commission has already stepped in to pay for 18,000 tons of cheese to be stored and kept off the market during the crisis. This will continue to put downward pressure on prices even as demand picks up. The effects are also seen in the red meat market. The reduced income of consumers has affected what product is chosen, resulting in a sharp and unprecedented fall in lamb prices, driven by the fact that French wholesale and open retail markets have closed due to the crisis. Moreover, the agricultural industry should pay close attention to state aid, since this will allow member states to subsidize their agriculture sectors on top of existing cap funding, potentially creating further distortions in the market. Globally, the pandemic has triggered discussions about drastic and permanent changes in attitudes towards global value chains that would particularly hit open economies like New Zealand. While rhetoric like this has always been prevalent in certain circles in the EU, COVID-19 has significantly raised the issue in the political agenda. And in the long term, European trade and industrial strategies could shift in this direction. So that means moving from purely political positioning into policy action. And this means that New Zealand could risk being caught up in a net of policies that are aimed at strategic rivals such as China. And I should add to this that tensions with the US don't make this situation any easier. Therefore, the NZ EU FTA is critical to mitigate this risk. Negotiations for an FTA are still ongoing, as Mr. Voss referred to at the beginning of this webinar. And I won't comment any further on that, except to say that maybe some folks from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade might be able to answer any questions you have about those negotiations. Finally, at the bottom of the slide, I've included some future milestones that you might want to take away from this webinar. The first is the package to be released today about the tourism, borders and transport. And then next week, the European Commission will release a comprehensive recovery plan. This will set out in much more detail further plans for the economic recovery in the EU. And then further down the line, we have the fallout from the German Constitutional Court and its ruling on the ECB quantitative easing. And then towards the end of the year, a potential no-deal Brexit will potentially add fuel to the fire and deepen the economic crisis. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention, and also my colleagues Rosario and Mathilde for helping me put this webinar together. If you have any specific questions, please feel free to ask away, and you can always contact us as well if you have any thoughts or comments about the webinar afterwards. So have a good day, everybody, and see you at the next one, potentially.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.